Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Sotah, Chodesh Tov. We're learning Mishna Sotah, Perek Ches, Chapter 8, Mishnah Zion, Mishnah 7. Now, all right, so the Mishnah now is going to talk about all the exemptions we were discussing until now, whether it be those who go to the border and then don't go to battle, whether it's those who don't even leave home at all. We're going to qualify that. Medvar Mamurim. When do we say this? When it comes to a voluntary war. Mitzvah, but something that falls under the category of a war that is a mitzvah to carry out. Hakol Yotzin, everyone goes out. Afilu chasan mechadroi v'chala mechupasa, even a chasan from his chamber, that where he is celebrating with his kala, and a kala from her chuppah. Everybody then goes to war. Now, it does not mean when it says a kala from her chuppah does not mean she actually goes to war. She doesn't. A bride is not required to fight on the battlefield, but she must aid in the war effort by supplying the soldiers with food and so on. Okay? So that's what it means, the kala. Now, what are we referring to here when we talk about voluntary wars and wars that are a mitzvah? Mm-hmm. Now, what's going to be very interesting is that, kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we're not really going to have an argument in the Mishnah regarding the exemptions per se. We're going to have an argument about how to categorize different types of wars. There are three types of wars that can be fought, and I'll read to you here from the introduction. Number one, a war fought to expand the boundaries of Israel, of Eretz Yisrael, which means such as the wars fought by David HaMelech and Aram Tzoib and Aram Naharayim. No. There were no threats. It was about expanding the borders. It was about maybe securing borders, but there were no actual threats there. It was about securing borders. It was about kind of taking over those. It was about expanding the borders, but not because of any kind of threat, but to expand the borders, which would make Eretz Yisrael a stronger place. That is one type of war. Another type of war is a preventative war intended to weaken an enemy before it attacks. We're not talking. You're preempting. You're going ahead and you're fighting a war to go ahead and weaken an enemy. It's an established enemy. There may not be right now, the enemy may not be attacking, but the point is there's an enemy there, there's the potential for danger, and you are going to secure the area from that enemy. And number three is Yoshua's conquest of the nations that lived in Eretz Yisrael and the war against Amalek. Those wars are examples of wars where the Torah specifically says you have to go and fight those wars. And therefore, what's happening in our Mishnah is the following. What's happening in our Mishnah is really going to be, how do we categorize some of these wars? Meaning, the war that is voluntary, the war that's just to expand the boundaries, that's called voluntary for sure. The war, what? Rishus, voluntary. The war to go ahead and to fight Amalek and to fight and to conquer Eretz Yisrael is obligatory. Okay? And therefore, when it comes to the voluntary war, the exemptions for sure apply. When it comes to the war that's an obligation,
gotta go.
You for sure got to go. You sure have to go. The war that we categorize as preempting the enemy, trying to weaken the enemy, what status does that have? Now, what's interesting is, so let's read the Mishnah now. When do we say this? By a voluntary war, mitzvah, but when it comes to an obligatory, a war that's a mitzvah to do, even a chasen from his, get a chamber and a kala from her chuppah. Now, what goes into Melchemes mitzvah? Right? This Tanakama talks about rishus, voluntary, and mitzvah. Right? But there are three types of war. So according to the Tanakama, what exactly, what is he including in Melchemes mitzvah? Right? That's a question. Let's read a little bit further. Rabbi Yehuda said, which right away signals to us Rabbi Yehuda is coming to argue on something. When do we say this? Mitzvah, by a milchem of war, by a war of mitzvah. I'm sorry. When it comes to a war of obligation, all have to go out to war. Even a chassan from his chamber, the kala mechupasa, and a kala from her chuppah. Okay, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what's the milchemes mitzvah? What's the milchemes chayva? What exactly are we all talking about here? It's not very clear. So the way to understand what's going on is like this. And as we're going to see, it comes out that the argument between them is not per se about what the Mishnah says specifically, but about something else. Now, the first Tana who distinguished between a voluntary war and a war of mitzvah. So they explain down here, this Tana classifies any war that is not specifically mandated by the Torah as non-obligatory. According to him, when you talk about a milchemes reshus, what's included in milchemes reshus? What's included in milchemes reshus is anything the Torah does not specifically say to fight. So expanding the borders and even weakening the enemy, Torah never talks about that. So that's called milchemes reshus. That's called voluntary. Okay, milchemes mitzvah, the one that's a war of mitzvah, is conquering Eretz Yisrael and destroying Amalek. So according to the Tanna Kama, the exemptions are applicable to milchemes reshus. That means the voluntary war, the war to expand the boundaries, and to weaken the enemy. That's when you have these exemptions. But if it's milchemes mitzvah, right, which means conquering Eretz Yisrael, fighting Amalek, everybody goes out. Okay, everybody goes out. Everybody has to go to fight the war. Okay, and the Mishnah says even a chassan from his room, from his chamber. That means he's married. We already learned that for the first year you don't got to do anything. You don't have to go help. Nonetheless, if it falls, once we're dealing with a milchemes mitzvah, even that man has to go out to battle. Okay, now let's look at Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, when do we say that there are going to be the exemptions by milchemes mitzvah, by milchema of a mitzvah? But a milchema of obligation, then everybody, no exemptions. So what is the milchemes mitzvah? What milchemes mitzvah is he talking about that we're saying that the exemptions apply? He's basically saying something can be categorized as milchemes mitzvah and the exemptions will still apply. The Tanna Kama, right, said the exemptions apply to things that are called voluntary reshus. And they don't apply to things called mitzvah. And the Tanna Kama said, and now Rabbi Yehuda says, when do we make these exemptions? By a milchemes mitzvah, by a war that's mitzvah to do. But if it's an obligation war, then everybody's free. So what is the milchemes mitzvah that he's talking about that he says the exemptions apply? The answer is, he's really talking about the same thing that Tanna Kama spoke about. Now again, as we said, the ones who expound the boundaries are for sure called reshus, called voluntary. But now the question is that the wars that are fought to weaken the enemy, what are they called? Rabbi Yehuda calls them milchemes mitzvah. He calls them a war that's a mitzvah to do. But he still says that the exemptions apply there. Because that's what he says. When do we say this? B'milchemes mitzvah, by milchem of war, which he's calling the wars to weaken the enemy a war of a mitzvah. And he's saying that's where the exemptions do apply. When don't they apply? By a category that he calls an obligatory war. And that's talking about the wars of conquering Eretz Yisrael, the wars of destroying Amalek, the wars that Torah specifically says has to be fought. Okay? Which means that they both, when it comes to exemptions, there's no argument. At the end of the day, they're both saying that when it comes to that war to weaken the enemy, do the exemptions apply? Yes, they do. Both say that. The question is, that type of war, how do you categorize it? Do you categorize it as reshus, as voluntary, or do you categorize it as mitzvah, as a war of mitzvah? What's the difference how you categorize it? The answer is like this. Let me read you how they explain it. Thus, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama agree that the Torah's exemptions apply even in a preventative war, and they disagree only about the classification of such a war. Tanna Kama deems it non-obligatory, while Rabbi Yehuda deems it a mitzvah. The practical difference is whether those participating in the war are exempt from doing other mitzvahs, according to the rule of ha'isek b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. One who is involved in a mitzvah is exempt from another mitzvah. That's the question. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who classifies a preventative war, the war to weaken the enemy, as a mitzvah, the participants need not do any other mitzvahs at that time. But according to the Tanna Kama, who does not call it a mitzvah, they remain obligated in other mitzvahs. Now, they don't explain what other mitzvahs we're talking about, but I believe what it's talking about is like this. Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema. You know, if this is Mochemes mitzvah, then if they're involved in this war of a mitzvah, then they're patur from Shema. Now, I don't think that means, while they're, fighting an enemy, right? You say, hold on a second, I got to say Shema, right? That's danger. You can't do that. But the point is that if you are involved in the battle, right? If you're involved somehow, right? You're involved in it. Maybe you're not fighting an enemy, but you're kind of waiting to go in, right? So, are you called Isaac b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah? Are you called somebody involved in a mitzvah who's exempt, and therefore you don't have to say Shema? Or is it not called a Mochemes mitzvah? It's not called a mitzvah to do, and therefore you would have to say Shema. So it comes out that the argument between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda is not about the exemptions. Everybody agrees the exemptions apply by a voluntary war, which means, according to everybody, to expand the boundaries. It applies even when you're trying to weaken the enemy. Everybody agrees exemptions apply there. And everybody agrees exemptions do not apply by the wars with Amalek and to conquer Eretz Yisrael. The whole argument is that type of war, the preventative war, the war to weaken the enemy. How do you classify it? Do you classify it as a war of mitzvah, meaning it's a mitzvah to do it, or it's a voluntary act? What's the difference? The difference is, if it is a war of mitzvah, it's called a mitzvah to do that war, then you are exempt from doing other mitzvahs. And if it's only categorized as voluntary, then you are not exempt from other mitzvahs. Have a wonderful day. A good Chodesh Tov. No?